If you ask our top economist at Uber, he would say that we actually don't control the price to the consumer.
They have 1 million drivers in the US right now, all averaging about $25 an hour, and then they have an extra 100,000 that want to come and join. Okay, what does that mean to that hourly average, right? So I think that's sort of what, Uber and Dara mean by that they don't set the rate. If they, sort of are charging passengers one thing and, they have an oversupply of drivers, obviously they can charge passengers less for those rides. They can charge passengers more for those rides. So that's sort of where I don't quite buy that argument that they don't set the rates.
Welcome to the RideShare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry, straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi went on a tech podcast called The Acquired Podcast recently, and he spent about an hour and a half talking about a range of different topics. And it's been a while since I've heard Dara do an interview like this where, frankly, I think he was pretty open. I know drivers might not love everything that he has to say, but I think he was pretty open and he talked about a lot of different topics and I think gave a lot of good insights into the company, sort of what they've been up to, where they're headed, what they're doing now, what they're focused on, some history, some cool personal stuff. So I think overall, from like an interviewer's perspective, I think these two hosts of Acquired Podcast did a really good job. And I recommend you go and check out the audio and video. There's a YouTube video that you can watch, or it's an audio podcast that you can listen to. But I'm going to summarize today 6 to 7 of the sort of main points, things that, stuck out in my head as I was listening, that I sort of took notes and said, oh, that was kind of interesting, or oh, I didn't know that, or oh, haven't been thinking about that. So no need to, if you don't have time to watch the full thing, then you're going to get the cliff notes right now and also my reaction. So, but I do recommend you go take a look and listen to that episode. So kudos to the Acquired guys for getting that interview because, they got him in person in Seattle. It's always a little better, to kind of talk to someone in person. It also seemed like they sort of liquored him up. There was kind of this silly cold open that they did where they kind of pretended that, Dara made this Uber Eats delivery. I don't know whose idea that was, but maybe edit that one out next time. But
I ordered some food. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we can eat while we Oh, it's here.
Did someone order Uber Eats?
Oh yeah, that's me.
All right, cool. It's got some wine in here.
Oh great, that's perfect.
So can I join you guys?
Actually, yeah, that'd be great. Come on in.
Come on in.
Who got the truth?
They did liquor him up and they were drinking wine the whole time, which is always good. As someone who does a lot of interviews, if you can get your guests, 1 or 2 drinks, loosens them up a little bit. And I think just makes for a more real conversation. So, without further ado, I want to get into the points that stood out for me from this Acquired interview with Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi and give you my reaction. So let's get into it.
And for me, the biggest lesson as I came to Uber was Uber's a marketplace business. Very, very fragmented supply base, right? It's 5.6 million drivers and couriers who are earning on our platform.
And a few million restaurants?
Yeah, close to 1 million restaurants. And for us, our growth is also supply-led. So if you think about post-pandemic, and one of the reasons why I think generally we're doing really well and gained a bunch of category share versus Lyft coming out of the pandemic was because we really focused on bringing those drivers back to the platform, building our service, et cetera. And it was a supply-led way of building the business, which definitely was a learning that I took from Booking.com.
With Booking,
All right, number one, he talked about very briefly, the number of drivers that they have. He said that they have 5.6 million drivers and couriers on the platform around the world, right? Obviously, Uber is global. And then he also said that they have 1 million restaurants on the platform now. So, I think the restaurants number is obviously a big one. And then obviously what I care about is the number of drivers. He also, I've sort of noticed, I think in the past year or two, Uber started calling all of their drivers, they used to call them partners, and then now in the past year or two, they've started calling them earners. So I don't know what's up with that, but that's what Uber and Dara, it's sort of funny. I feel like a corporate memo must go out and it's like, okay, we're now calling partners, we're calling them earners now. So that's their thing. That's what they've called them. But it is funny because every single I've never heard a driver actually refer to Uber drivers or couriers as partners. And I've also never heard them refer to them as earners. So it's kind of funny because drivers just keep calling them drivers, but we'll let Uber do their thing. So I just thought that stat was kind of interesting because obviously it's a big number, and Dara talked at the end of the podcast about how, in the federal, they're probably one of the biggest, I guess we wouldn't call them employers because they're not employees, but they are hiring a large, maybe one of the biggest companies, hiring people in the United States. Walmart might have a couple million people and Uber has 4.5 million around the world. So I think just kind of at that scale was interesting. So that was sort of the first warm-up thing that I noticed.
If you ask our top economist at Uber, he would say that we actually don't control the price to the consumer. That it's actually the spot price for this kind of labor the marketplace sets based on the supply of labor coming in and the demand for transportation. And so there's this, people say like Uber setting prices. He'd say, we're not setting prices.
Number 2, Dara talked about driver pay. So back in the day, Uber used to always say, that when we cut rates, I can't remember how they phrased it, but they used to say, when we cut rates, drivers will actually make the same because demand will go up and then your earnings, even though you're getting paid lower per mile and per minute, you'll be busier and you'll make the same amount of money. And there was a certain point where they kind of flipped more recently, maybe a few years ago, where they started saying the market dictates rates. We don't we don't tell drivers what they make. It's passengers that set the price. And Dara sort of got into this again. He says, Uber doesn't set pay. It's whatever passengers are willing to pay. I think there was, I don't know about famous, but there was a study, semi-famous study. I think it was Orton at NYU, and he used a bunch of Uber driver earnings data and sort of, did a bunch of fancy math. And that was the gist of what he found is to sort of support this theory that, Uber doesn't set the rates and that, it's basically, passengers pay a price, and if there's not if there's a bunch of drivers that come onto the platform, for example, right, and now they're not as busy, and then drivers obviously, if let's say they're getting paid, average driver right now is earning $25 an hour, and that's too high, right, or $35 an hour. There's not enough supply, and then if basically that comes down, if a bunch of drivers join the platform, right, because it's like, wow, this is a great earning opportunity, then that will sort of naturally come down, and so that's sort of kind of like been Uber's latest, the past few years, I guess you would say that's like their latest way of describing pay, and I think they sort of try not to get in the middle of it, but I don't know. I don't really buy it. I mean, Uber literally determines, the rates. I mean, they don't have a set rate card anymore for drivers, which I think is frustrating. They quote an upfront fare to passengers and drivers now, right? And then they can kind of be in the middle of that, so they really are the ones setting rates. And I think that they could argue that, hey, we don't set the rates, it's whatever the passengers are willing to pay, and but they're the ones who they see, okay, if drivers are 40% utilized, right, or 20% or 30%, it's not like they publish any of this. So I don't know if I really buy that argument, and I know that it's one that pisses off drivers. So definitely, I think that's one that I sort of call BS on.
If we entered some economic environment where a whole bunch of people were out of work and they wanted to become Uber drivers, but that would make it so that the average earnings across the whole platform would plunge because you have a whole ton of new drivers coming on, would you guys sort of gate it and be like, hey, we want to make sure that we don't sort of flood the supply side of the marketplace?
No, because one of our core philosophies is this is an open platform, and if your background check comes in okay, et cetera, then you can have access to earnings opportunities. That's a core belief for us. The economics take care of themselves, right? When you look at mid-cycle, long cycle, if earnings come down on the platform, then it becomes a less attractive platform to drivers, and they will do something else. There is this counter-cyclicality about our marketplace, which is during really good times, it becomes harder for us to recruit drivers. So the cost of supply goes up. So while revenue and gross bookings are growing and unit volumes are strong, our supply base becomes more expensive. During softer economic times, you get more drivers coming into the platform, ETAs come down, prices come down, the price becomes cheaper. So actually our unit volumes accelerate. So if you look like our Q1 unit volumes, they grew 24% versus 19% in Q4. So we accelerated, trip growth, which is not something that you see at our scale. but it's some of this stuff working out.
Right. So it's sort of the invisible hand of the market theory that sort of self-regulates this for you.
Yeah, it's not a theory. It happens.
Yeah, I guess yeah.
It's this very cool experiment.
Yeah.
Economists like to talk about like things in theory, but like you actually have one of the largest data sets in human history of, people doing work and other people consuming services.
Yeah, if you ask our top economist at Uber, he would say that we actually don't control the price to the consumer. That it's actually the spot price for this kind of labor the marketplace sets based on the supply of labor coming in and the demand for transportation. And so there's this, people say like Uber setting prices. He'd say, we're not setting prices.
So sort of along the lines, one of the questions that the Acquired Guys did ask that I really like was sort of a macro question about what if, the economy isn't maybe doing so hot and a bunch of people start coming to Uber, right? Because it's a great job. You can kind of, get signed up easily. And basically, I interpreted the question as like, what if there's an oversaturation of drivers? And I think this has been a big concern for drivers over the past 6 to 12 months, right? We had this period during the pandemic where there weren't enough drivers. And now, Uber is saying, our supply of drivers is recovering, and we're starting to hear a lot of complaints from drivers that, it's not as busy as it used to be, right? There's a lot of these data points that, hey, it's July 4th weekend and it wasn't very busy, like it has been in the past. Drivers are complaining they're not seeing as good of weekly incentives, right? And so I think there's definitely something to the possibility that there might be some oversaturation. And, Dara said something really interesting. He said that Uber will never limit the number of drivers that can sign up and drive on the platform, right? If you look at other services like DoorDash, for example, or others, they do limit, right? I think Jay, one of our contributors in San Francisco, tried to sign up for DoorDash recently, and they had too many drivers, so they wouldn't let him sign up. They use sort of more of a scheduling system, right? So they you do actually have to kind of book, blocks in advance, right? Whereas Uber and Lyft have really always been the opposite. It's log on whenever and wherever you want, drive as much or as little, and that's obviously something drivers really love, that flexibility. And so it's kind of interesting that he said that, even if they have this huge glut of drivers, they won't limit, hey, we're not taking any new drivers. They're always, at least according to Dara, and I believe him, he says that we're always going to take more and more drivers. And I don't know that this is necessarily a good thing for drivers, because this does go back to his point that, hey, if let's say they have 1 million drivers in the US right now, all averaging about $25 an hour, and then they have an extra 100,000 that want to come and join, okay, what does that mean to that hourly average, right? Obviously, it's going to come down if demand stays the same, right? Because now they have more drivers. Drivers are sort of willing to work for less, and they're going to be paid less per hour, right? So I think that's sort of what Uber and Dara mean by that they don't set the rates. It's kind of a function of supply and demand, but at the same time, they have a take rate that they take, right? So if they, sort of are charging passengers one thing and, they have an oversupply of drivers, obviously they can charge passengers less for those rides. They can charge passengers more for those rides. So that's sort of where I don't quite buy that argument that they don't set the rates. Now, one thing I would like to see, with this, if there is potential driver saturation, is I would like to see them, let's say they are going to, keep hiring drivers forever. Now, I know this is something that drivers would not like, right? Like the idea of, if there's 1 million drivers out there right now and they're going to add 100,000, if that's less work for drivers, that's not a good thing, right? At an individual level. But if that's what they say they're going to do, I think one thing I really would like to see Uber do is reward loyalty, right? We hear from a lot of new drivers who love the fact that they can get onboarded, that it's so easy, right? To get signed up. And so I get the sort of the sentiment that like, hey, once you're in, right, like you don't want other people to join because it's a good job. And if they join, your pay is going to go down. But I do think that if you've been a good driver, if you've been a loyal driver, you should be rewarded, right? In a time of oversaturation. Maybe that means, priority requests at the airport, priority customer support, better trips, more trips, right? I think that you should have some sort of advantage, maybe better bonuses, right? Better rewards, whatever it might be. I think that this is an opportunity, sort of on the rewards and loyalty to the best drivers. Like if you're someone like me who doesn't drive that often and isn't that reliable, I probably shouldn't be rewarded by Uber, right? But if you're someone like Jay or Sergio that has 30,000 trips, like Jay has 30,000 trips under his belt and a 5-star rating, like that's someone who should get priority and loyalty, especially so that you come into a situation where, hey, Uber adds 100,000 brand new drivers right off the street, and now those veteran drivers are like kind of at the same starting point as everyone else, right? Because I think that's one thing that Uber has really messed up over the years, is that like during the good times when they have a lot of drivers, they don't take advantage of it, right? And they don't say like, hey, we're going to reward the best drivers, so that when there are times that are tougher for drivers, for example, it's like they've built that relationship over time. Now when, during the pandemic, when they were, very low on supply of drivers and they needed drivers and they were trying to, get people back driving, everyone was like, dude, this company screwed us. Like, why the hell would we come back and work for you, right? And so I think that's one thing that they could do a much better job of, and I hope that they do. I don't know, Dara didn't really talk about it, but that would be sort of my recommendation there.
High take rates are dangerous. So our job as a company is to grow volume as much as we can, as fast as we can, and make our shareholders happy enough.
Yep.
Minimizing the take rate, which is taking as much of that dollar and giving it to drivers and couriers. Like last quarter, gross bookings grew over 22% or so, which is really good. The money that drivers and couriers, including tips, made on the platform grew by 30% higher. And at the same time, we were able to expand our margins, be free cash flow positive. So like the design spec that we're building is, how do you like torture the organization? Because sometimes it is torture. Like watch every single nickel and dime, be incredibly efficient in everything that you do, automate everything, get fraud out of the system, et cetera, so that you can actually operate a business at scale at the lowest take rate possible.
And then, kind of along those lines, another topic he talked about was take rate. So Dara said something interesting here. He said that he actually doesn't plan to increase Uber's take rate, right? So, the take rate is typically the gross of the ride, right? So if a passenger is paying $10 and then Uber is keeping $3 in revenue, that take rate is 30%, right? And he actually said that last quarter, Uber's take rate went down, right? So that's basically saying like their bookings went up and, the amount that they were taking from drivers sort of, that rate didn't increase as quickly, right? So he's basically saying their take rate went down last quarter. And the reason why he said that happened is because they didn't want to sacrifice growth, right? Or typically, right, I think the interviewers did ask him a good question at the end about whether he would want a company with 20 or 30%, he would want to run a company with 20 or 30% take rate. And Dara picked the 20% because he said that, you have to be a little careful, right? Like taking 30% sort of sounds good, but, over long term, it can hurt other areas, right? It can hurt your relationship with drivers. It can hurt, your sort of growth rates. And I think this was interesting because Uber has done a horrible job messaging take rate to drivers. Like it's probably a top 3 complaint that we hear from drivers is that, Uber takes too much, out of every single trip. And if you ask drivers, they'll say 40, 50, 60, 70, 80%, on average, right? Which is actually not the case. We've done lots of analysis and I know drivers don't like to hear it, but on average, that take rate is closer to 20 to 30% overall. And you can actually look at your weekly earnings statement. So if you're a driver, you can look at your weekly earnings statement. I believe you might have to pull it up online. I don't know if you can do it from the app, but you can definitely do it from your online dashboard and you can see, or you might have to click an option or details or something like that. And you can see that weekly statement and sort of what Uber's overall take rate. And, I think the average is probably quite surprising, but it doesn't really matter. Drivers think that it's a lot higher than it actually is. And so I think that's a huge failing on Uber's part because, perception is more important than reality, right? If a bunch of drivers are out there and they're, not driving, they're quitting because they're not lasting on the platform as long because they think Uber's take rate is really high, then that's something that, is a big mistake, right? Like I think it's like kind of a wasted, almost like a wasted, kind of opportunity, right? Because it's like people are quitting even though it's not even really the reality, right? Like over a perception that's not true. So I think the take rate comment that he made was interesting. He doesn't want to sacrifice growth. I mean, he talked a lot about, sort of, I'm sure what investors want to hear. He said that, they want to increase their free cash flow by getting more efficient, trimming the fat instead of increasing their take rate. So it sort of seemed to me that he has a bit of of a growth mindset still, that he's still thinking this company can grow, and that, hey, like, we understand we could charge the passengers more right now and we could try to pay the drivers less, but I think he still feels, he actually said this comment, he said that he still feels like supply is about 5% below where demand is. So that tells me that he's still trying to ramp up that supply. They're still trying to bring that take rate down, pay more to drivers, and then maybe once they get more in balance, or if there's a situation where the economy really turns, recession, whatever it might be, and they get a glut of drivers, that's when I think that there'll be more drivers, and then obviously they can because they'll have that oversupply compared to demand, they can either increase prices on passengers, but that would actually mean less rides, right? So they would probably keep prices the same for passengers and maybe drop that down a little bit, maybe increase their take rate. So they have a lot more flexibility there, I guess you would say. So I thought his comments on take rate were interesting because this is obviously a big issue for drivers and the take rate that Uber takes on every single trip.
Thought about where you used to need to do something different or counterposition the market in order to be successful, where now you sort of look around and you're like, actually, in this area, we're the incumbent. So there's a different strategy that we need to lean into as an incumbent.
Our working with taxis was an interesting twist, right? Which is, to some extent, they have been definitionally the competition, or we have been the competition or the challenger to those incumbents. At some point, we became much bigger than taxi. But in the end, if you remove yourself from the emotions, et cetera, and, we're competing against X or Y, we're in the job of wiring up, vehicles and drivers who want to drive people to places, and that includes taxi. Like, there are 4.5 million of them, and if you take the hypothesis, which is the days of old where you wave your arm to, wave a taxi down, like, things are changing, then it was a move that was obvious.
So another thing he talked about he mentioned this a few times, were the taxi partnerships in the future. And so right now in the US, Uber is partnered with Curb and Flywheel in San Francisco. And it seems like they're kind of, I wouldn't say touting it, but I do think they're pushing it pretty hard. I do think that, this sort of stemmed during the pandemic when they had this major undersupply of drivers, and they were sort of like, oh man, where can we go, right? Where are we going to get drivers from? And they had this idea to start partnering with taxi companies. It's a little bit ironic that, the partnerships have sort of slowly been rolled out, and they're kind of probably eventually going to start going full steam ahead when they've almost recovered on the supply side, and supply and demand are kind of, back to almost back to even. And I think that for drivers, one of the things I've always been worried about these taxi partnerships is that I don't know that it actually does that much good for Uber and Lyft drivers, because it's like adding hundreds of thousands of drivers, taxi drivers, to the road, right? So I think you have a lot of those potential problems with oversupply, and I'm kind of curious to see, how Uber is going to handle that, right? Like, are they going to sort of just screw over all the existing UberX drivers, or what, because I think for the company, I sort of see why they're doing it and why it makes sense. And, it kind of is part of a larger, I wouldn't say degradation of the service, but, back in the day, UberX was nice. It was fancy, nice cars. And now, I think it's much more regular, right? Like, some of the cars are pieces of shit, and, some of the drivers aren't that great. And, now you might not get an Uber, you might get a taxi, right? But ultimately, I think what Uber has really shown is that their product is so good because people care the most about getting from A to B cheaply and reliably, right? And that's what the app enables, right? And so if you think about that's what passengers care most about, what do taxis do? Taxis help that out big time, right? If you add 400,000 taxis to the network, or even 100,000, right? Now you have more supply. They have the option to, take rides or not. And if you're a rider and you want to get somewhere, across town, and, you have a 7-minute ETA, but if they start adding taxis, now you can get there in 4 or 5 minutes, great. Or if normal, that surge pricing ride is $30 and now you can get it for 20, great. Like, I don't think I know passengers aren't going to care whether it's an UberX or a taxi, if it is adding to the reliability and lowering prices. But I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think this is going to be a bad thing for existing Uber drivers. So I would love to hear from folks in the comments if there's any way that a taxi partnership could be good for Uber and Lyft drivers. I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, that's sort of, kind of the direction it's heading. I think it could definitely lead to oversupply and a lot of the issues that I talked about, but this is clearly, the direction that Uber is moving. So probably good for taxis, maybe good for Uber customers, but not so good for Uber drivers.
On the demand side, Eats is the recipient, so the rides business has most of the audience, and generally we move more people from rides to Eats. So it's a almost free customer acquisition tool for Eats.
It's your largest customer acquisition channel for Eats, right?
Yeah, we get more new customers from rides than we do from Google, Meta, Instagram, all of these other channels combined.
It's pretty nice to own your own
It's
media.
awesome.
It's
Yeah,
crazy.
At a quarter of the cost. So it's like it's a proprietary channel and it's cheaper. And then on the supply side,
do you like charge internally for?
totally.
Oh,
Yeah, totally.
Well, it's an even advertising business, right? So it's an
Yeah,
ad
right.
unit like any other.
Exactly. And
We're gonna have to start charging each other for
Stop.
plugs on the. Okay.
we can tell you a little bit about internal pricing mechanisms. but all of it sounds great. But the fact is that whatever pixel that you put on the Rides app to promote Eats is taking something away from the Rides app.
All right, now the last topic that I want to talk about is Uber Eats versus DoorDash. And, I think the interviewers did a really good job asking some pointed questions, some topical stuff, learned a lot about Dara and his history. But at the same time, I think they, kind of got him to answer, pretty honestly. And, it really kind of gave me a lot of insights into where the company is at and kind of a lot of the things that they're thinking about. And probably the biggest surprise, maybe even shocker to me, was that Dara really, I would say, hinted or, even basically laid out the fact that they're coming after DoorDash, right? So I kind of retold this story about how Uber Eats used to be the market share leader when it came to food delivery, and then DoorDash, was this execution machine. They went after the suburbs and lots of different choices for restaurants. And Uber Eats kind of focused on what they knew well from rides, right? The city centers, it was speed and reliability. And that strategy ended up not being the winning strategy in food. I think I did an interview with Emil Michael on my podcast, and he really let it rip on Uber and Dara because I think he felt strongly, he left the company with Uber and Uber Eats. Uber Eats was in, sort of the market share lead, and then Dara came in and lost it. So I think factually that's correct. So that interview that I did with him was interesting, but I think in this interview that Dara did with Acquired, he really, basically said we're coming after DoorDash and the way that Uber is going to do it. So DoorDash does have about 2/3 market share in the food delivery space in the US, but Uber actually does more gross revenue abroad, right? Because they have the whole Uber Eats worldwide ecosystem. So they're actually doing more volume than DoorDash because they're a worldwide company. When it comes to, we're talking Uber Eats versus DoorDash, right? And so I think, Dara basically said, hey, we're going to use our international profits. I don't know how profitable food delivery is internationally, but right, typically the orders are lower, but I don't know if it is profitable. He says, on paper, at least, I think this strategy sounds good. He says, we're going to use international profits and our rideshare delivery synergies to go after DoorDash, right? So what are some of those synergies? Well, for example, he said that Uber Eats' biggest source of new customers is actually from UberX, right? So it's basically like mobility customers who end up ordering Uber Eats. They see it, they always see it, the little ads in UberX or pushing you notifications or whatever. And, I was even in an Uber the other day. I just posted about this, and Uber is doing these new ad tablets and paying drivers 7 cents a ride, which is nothing. But the 3 ads that I saw were for Uber One, which is their membership program, Uber Eats, there were these little ads that were running, and some other Uber Reserve, right, their scheduled rides product. So it was interesting because that makes a lot of sense, right? There are, I think Uber does 8 million rides a day, I want to say, or maybe more now, or maybe over 8 millions of rides a day. I would guess 8 million rides a day, 8.5 if I had to put a number on it. And so, if you think 1% of those people end up are being inspired to order Uber Eats that day, or maybe, right, it's like 1% of 8 million is still a huge number, right? It's still 800,000 people, right? 800,000 customers in one day, and that's a 1% conversion rate, right? So you can imagine that sort of for new customers, for frequency, for reminding people like, hey, you've probably been in an Uber and it says like, hey, want Uber Eats, delivered at your house. You're on the way home from airport. Do you want a meal there, right? So a lot of that stuff, I don't think the conversions are super high, but because it's such low cost for Uber that, they sort of have a lot of free marketing. So I think those synergies make a lot of sense. And, people ask me a lot about rideshare and delivery synergies. And I actually always say, I think there's a lot more synergies on the customer side. I think Uber Eats has a big advantage on the customer side because of Uber, more so than the drivers. In the past year, I think Uber has really tried to hype up the synergies between rideshare and delivery. And Dara has talked about it a lot, and he's out there delivering on an e-bike and things like that. But I don't know, I've sort of been, on paper, it sounds good. It's like, hey, you're onboarded, and, Dara talked about this in the interview, you're onboarded as a delivery driver, there's no background check, it doesn't matter the vehicle, and then we can upgrade you to Uber X, in the future. But in reality, what kind of ends up happening is that it's sort of siloed. Like the type of people who are attracted to rideshare and people, they have a nicer, newer car, which is obviously more expensive, right? They're maybe more of a people person. They're kind of trying to maximize their earnings. So you can definitely make more money with rideshare. When it comes to food delivery, right? You can have any vehicle, which I think is kind of a downside, right? Like compared to rideshare. I almost call food delivery like kind of dummy proof. You don't have to talk to anyone. You don't have to deal with anyone. There's no customer service. Just go to the restaurant, you pick it up and you drop it off, right? Pretty simple in that respect. I mean, we see a lot of people that are out there delivering as a family, right? Like boyfriend, girlfriend. I feel like 10% of the deliveries that I get here in LA, I see two people in the car. It's easier, to do parking when you have someone there. It's easier to have their second person navigate, right? And so I think because of those dynamics, I've always been very skeptical. We don't see a lot of crossover. We don't see people doing like lunchtime deliveries and then popping back over to UberX. At our Curbivore conference, we had a courier on stage during an interview with Uber Eats VP of Product, Sachin Kansal. And, one of the things she said was like, I was delivering some stinky food and then I had a passenger in the car come and give me a low rating, right? So even logistically, it's hard to do both rideshare and delivery. So I think the synergies are I think they exist, but I think they're somewhat limited on the supply side when it comes to rideshare and delivery. But I do think there are some really good synergies on the customer side, sort of like how Dara was talking about, right? So I think this strategy, if you think about the kind of Uber flywheel, right, between rides and delivery, it's like, okay, we've got rides, we've got the best product on rides, people are ordering, we've got 8 million rides happening every day. So it's like there's some new customers that are going to come from that. And, think about Uber Eats, they've got this, membership Uber One, right? So it's like, hey, I'm going to sign up for Uber One because of, Uber X, right? Because I'm taking it all the time, or my work expenses it, or whatever it might be. Oh, I get my first delivery fee. I don't think you actually get that, but, maybe they offer that, or you get your delivery fees off 10%, right? So it's like, okay, they can loop customers in through that Uber One program. And then the other thing I think is frequency. I remember one time when I interviewed Daniel Danker, who used to be head of Uber Eats, and I think he really sort of ingrained in my head this concept of frequency and how important it is. Like Uber Eats, I think delivery is like kind of a shitty business. I don't think it's very, isn't profitable. Doordash, I think, has maybe once turned a profit in their best revenue quarter ever. It sort of took like an all-time high, right, to turn a profit. And so I'm quite skeptical of the model inherently, but I do think it does help a lot with frequency, right? And so you can think of it maybe as a loss leader, right? Like, hey, food delivery, how many times do you have to eat a day? 3 times? You need a coffee? That's another one. You want dessert? That's another one, right? How many times do you need a ride somewhere? It's like you're typically going to and from work. Those are the busy times. And then Friday, Saturday nights, right? So, I think the ride hail users are kind of more powerful because they're spending more and, they're willing to, Uber has a lot more pricing power in those situations. Whereas food delivery, it's like you have a million alternatives, right? But you're doing it a lot, right? And so I think that frequency is important. Like, how does DoorDash get people to think about continuously opening their app without pushing them a bunch of notifications? Right? If Uber is doing 8 million rides a day and it's like, oh, they can kind of keep reminding people to order Uber Eats, right? Even if it's 1% of that 8 million, right? It's like, oh yeah, I got to eat soon. I think there's still, again, that's like kind of leads to that flywheel and, kind of benefits Uber, right? So they've got that membership for new customers. They've got the rides itself for new customers, and they have the sort of rides piece that, kind of like reminds you to use Uber Eats, right? Versus DoorDash. I mean, they don't have any of that, right? They're going to have to spend money on marketing and partnerships. And, that's sort of what I think they've done a really good job. And this all ties into the sort of final thing that Dara mentioned a few times during the interview, and it was sort of this concept of, like it takes a while to turn around an oil tanker, right? He came in, stock went down, and now it's like, all right, for better or worse, like they're implementing a lot of their processes. They shedded the inefficiencies. They got rid of, self-driving and all this crap that was, like non-core to the business. And now they're focused, right? And I think there's definitely some legitimacy to that. I mean, if you look at their free cash flow, right? If you look at their stock price, right? Like they're definitely trending up in the right direction. So if I was DoorDash, I mean, I think on paper, this strategy that Dara described about how Uber Eats is coming after DoorDash, I think on paper, it sounds pretty good. I might be a lot scared if I was DoorDash and really be thinking about, hey, how am I going to combat that? How am I going to combat this effort from Uber Eats? Because like they're starting to execute and they have this advantageous flywheel that we don't have. So, obviously we'll see what happens, but I think on paper it's sounding pretty good for Uber Eats to potentially start competing with DoorDash. And I mean, I think the final thing that I would say there is, Uber started off in the cities, right? It is the busiest in the city centers. And that was really like kind of their downfall with Uber Eats, is because that's what they also focused on, where DoorDash did the suburbs approach, right? Higher average order values, and it's more spread out, but you have families ordering, and that's kind of how they gained such a big market share. And now, Dara said another thing that I had never heard before. He said that Uber is starting to go after rides in those more suburban markets. I can't tell you how many emails I got over the years where, people would say, oh, we're out in the middle of nowhere, or we're outside the city and Uber doesn't work too well, there's no drivers, and I want to start my own company. And because you could really tell in the first 5 years of the company, the suburbs were not a focus at all. They almost like didn't care, gave up on them. And it was interesting to hear Dara say this specifically. I've never heard him say this, or anyone at Uber say that we're going to start going after these suburbs, right? And what that means in the context of food delivery is it could give them a little leg up there, right? Because of that customer flywheel, right? Hey, now we're serving rides, or, we're doing more scheduled rides, or, providing a better experience in those suburbs. And now we can kind of, you leverage some of those customers to get on to food delivery, right? And compete with DoorDash, where they have typically had much more of a stronghold. So yeah, I think that's sort of, kind of very interesting on the Uber Eats versus DoorDash side of things. So we'll check back in a year or 2 or 3 and see what happens. I know Uber likes to throw me a bone every couple years and let me interview Dara. So I think that time is coming up. So there's questions that you want to ask Dara. I would love to know. Let me know what you thought about the interview and my points here. Would love to hear from you. And until next time, all right, take care.